Okay, hi everyone. Good morning to you all. If everything goes well and the unexpected doesn't happen, on Wednesday this week, President-elect Biden will take the oath of office as the 46th President of the United States of America. This, of course, will certainly change the course of the US administration for a number of reasons, both domestically and internationally. Of course, like ours on new trends in global trade governance, as well as our ESCI-UPF Jean Monnet Module on knowledge and innovation for the European trade challenges, cannot avoid such circumstances and cannot ignore such an important event this week. For this reason, I'm very glad and honored to introduce you Dr. Marc Jeffery, Associate Professor at Blanquerna Universitat Ramon Llull here in Barcelona, and coordinator of the International Relations degree at this university. Previous to that, Dr. Jeffery served as head of communication in the European Commission's representation here in the city in Barcelona for over 15 years. Yeah, if I'm not wrong, time flies, Mark. I mean, this academic and professional background, and I'm sure his personal taste for the topic today, make of Dr. Jeffery an unbeatable speaker to our session to analyze the past, the present, and the future of the US-EU economic, commercial, and political relations. Good afternoon, Mark, and again, thank you a lot for accepting our invitation to join us today.
Hello, Joan Perrin. Thank you very much for inviting me.
As you all know, people, our session today is not conceived as a classic plain lecture. Okay, we are considering more as a informal talk to an expert on the field. I myself prepared a list of topics and questions that I'd like Mark to see and review along this session, but please take it as an invitation to you all to jump in and to follow up our discussion. Okay. For the sake of simplicity and good order of the session, however, I ask you all, I beg you to ask your questions in written via chat, and I personally will take care of them and rephrase them out loudly to Mark. Okay, I have the feeling, Mark, that as in many other fields of our social sciences, in order to understand the present and the future relations between the US and the European Union from Wednesday onwards, we also need to bear in mind the historical path that brought us here. In this always complex transatlantic relations, I think it's more than necessary to rescue the failed TTIP, the transatlantic trade and investing partnership. As you were in the European Commission at that time, 2013, when the negotiations were launched, could you please, Mark, to share with us your memories of those years in relation to the launching and developing of this TTIP? Was it perceived at the very beginning as a game changer, as it was considered later on? what were the expectations, or what is your feeling about the expectations of both Washington and Brussels at that time? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jean-Pierre. Whenever anybody refers to me as an expert, I always find it mildly terrifying. But I did live through the whole of the TTIP experience, shall we say? So I can say some things about it. I think it would be a mistake to think that the change in a particular administration or government could have a really significant change in trade policy, because things work very, very slowly. It's like changing the direction of one of these huge ships. Things can go very slowly. Trade agreements can take up to 10 years to negotiate, would be standard, going from the first political idea to having something which enters into force can take 10 years. And so you go across administrations. TTIP was started under Obama and would possibly have finished under Trump. TPP before it started under George W. Bush and was signed by Obama. So it goes across administrations with different opinions. And there are differences, and maybe we can come on to that as a separate question, what we might expect from a Biden administration. We can have a look at something that's obviously difficult to predict the future, but there are some indications. But I think we're not talking about a huge game changer. Perhaps when I was thinking about this, and maybe I can answer this question with a bit of a long answer, and then we can go on to very short, and I'll try and be more specific with other questions. But when I was thinking about how to talk about all of this and how to present it, I mean, there's two general points that I think are important to bring up to start with when we're looking at TTIP, when we're looking at the whole of the TTIP experience and where that might be going in the future. The first point would be that I think there are always three different perspectives you have to have on trade policy, and you have to have them all in mind at the same time. The first is the economics perspective, and you're mostly economics, so I stand back here a bit, and you're the expert. But from my limited knowledge of economics on that, I think there's pretty much agreement on the benefit of trade policy. Trade can have negative effects, but the general benefits of trade policy are very well accepted, to the extent that, as I understand it, some economists argue that it would make sense unilaterally to get rid of all barriers. I would benefit just from getting rid of all barriers, even if the other country still keeps them, to that extent. So that's the economics perspective. And again, I'm not going to go into that because you're the experts on that. But at the same time, there's also a political perspective. And that political perspective has to be worked in terms of both foreign policy and domestic policy. In terms of foreign policy objectives very often get mixed up with trade policy objectives. The very fact that in the European Union, in the treaties, trade policy comes within the section on foreign policy, is that, and also in terms of how relations with Russia have gone since the Crimean crisis, when trade policy was used to try and deal with that and failed, or the recent criticisms this week and last week about the investment agreement with China, shows how much foreign policy is mixed up with trade policy, and there was exactly the same with the United States as well. So that's foreign policy, but there's also domestic policy, and here there's always this temptation to try and protect our own people. So when you're talking about trade, whatever the economics arguments might be, there's always very strong political arguments, and there's always these political arguments that we need to protect our own people. We need to protect our own citizens, our own businesses, our own standards. And the temptation on that is always, let's build a wall, which is the opposite of trade policy, of opening trade policy. So those political factors come into the economics factors. And then there's a third perspective, which is just that trade has always existed. That when you go back to the first civilizations and you had city-states or whatever, as soon as you had collectives, some kind of society, some kind of civilization, you had two things. You had people fighting each other and you had people trading with each other. And war and trade go right back to the beginning of civilization. So whatever the economists say and whatever the politicians say, trade will still continue to some extent. So you've got those three policies. That's my first point. You've got these three political, and when you analyze the relationship with the United States, it is this mixture of economics, foreign policy, domestic policy, and the fact that this is going on anyway. And that leads me to my second point, my second general point before I actually get to answer your question, which is that this relationship already exists and it's already probably the most important trade relationship in the world and in history. The relationship between the European Union and the US is a huge trade relation. The statistics are that trade between the EU and the US is worth 3 billion euros every day, 3 trillion euros a year. When you get to figures this big, and as head of communication at the Commission for a long time, I worked out eventually that when you get to figures this big, all it means is a lot. But it means an awful lot. There is an awful lot of money here, which means that there's an awful lot of interest as well. So this relationship is highly developed. Over half of all foreign investment in the European Union is made by US companies. Over half of all foreign investment in the US is made by EU companies. I don't know how Brexit will affect that, but the statistics are impressive. This is a very, very important relationship. And of course, this relationship works according to rules. So rules are already there. So when you're talking about a new trade agreement, you're not talking about making rules or creating a relationship. You're talking about whether there's a need to update the current rules. It's not like Brexit, where things could fall off a cliff. There isn't a vacuum. We're working with existing rules, and if no TTIP happened, as it didn't, then there's existing rules, existing framework, which is still going to work. It may have faults. There may be things that can be improved. Of course, there are, but there's still a legal regulatory framework which is in operation. So, I mean, those are my two preliminary points. There are these three different perspectives and that the relationship already exists. So to actually answer your question about the factors that came in when TTIP was developed, I mean, my focus is much more European Union. You'd have to ask someone from the US side about, to be precise about that. I can guess what the US ideas were, but there were long-standing factors. So there were long-standing factors to do again with this economics idea that yes, there was still much more potential, that by changing the regulatory framework, by improving things, you could increase the level of trade, you could promote more trade. So right from the 1990s, there were serious proposals for a new trade treaty, Leon Breton in the mid-90s. By 2007, so before the crisis hit, we'd already established the Transatlantic Economic Forum. So there was a structured discussion about how to deal with trade issues, whether it was bilateral or multilateral through the US and the EU. So that was already developing then. Secondly, there was pressure on the EU and the US to try and reinvigorate the multilateral trading system. So to try and get people back into the WTO, to try and get the WTO working again. So for example, part of the vision very consciously, and again, maybe that is something from the US side, is that there was this vision that if you have the TPP, if you have the agreement with the Pacific Rim countries, and then you have an Atlantic agreement too, you've got pretty much all of the world sewn up. And in that respect, the idea was you will force the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa to come and deal with the World Traders and World Traders Organization. And to that extent, when the TTIP was launched, Brazil became much more interested in renegotiating things on a multilateral framework. So it did seem to be moving things in that respect. So there was this idea of using TTIP in combination with the TPP to reinvigorate the WTO. And that leads on to the third aspect was these background political concerns, which was about maintaining global influence in the world. As both the EU and the US, I mean, basically came out of the Second World War having created the trading system, and Bretton Woods didn't really work with trade as much as it worked with other areas, but there was the GATT, eventually the WTO. And that was very much modeled on the interests of the US and the British Empire, which then transmogrified into the interests of the European Union. But those interests were there, and the influence was there. It was trade was very much made in that mold. Demographically and economically, it was clear that other countries are coming up, other countries are going to have more influence. So if the US and the EU want to maintain their global influence, then they've got to work together. And if they do work together, certainly at the moment and for the foreseeable future, they're an unbeatable combination. So if they had been able, for example, to agree on global standards, which was one of the background ideas of TTIP, then those standards, just because the EU and the US had fixed common standards, those standards would de facto become global standards. So it was there was this idea that by combining things, if you have an agreement between the EU and the US, that's going to become de facto the global trading rules, and you're going to push China out of the picture in that for quite some time. So there was this element of it, which is not necessarily compatible with what you're saying about wanting to get people back into the WTO, but anyway, that's politics. So there was all these long-standing factors. What actually pushed the thing over in terms of domestic politics and getting rid of this reluctance in domestic politics, what actually pushed the thing over was the economic crisis. That it was a big idea, that at that time people were desperate. Politicians remember that Obama had started his mandate 2009, Barroso started his second mandate 2009, so just after the peak of the crisis 2008. And what they wanted was some big idea to sell. So there was this idea of counter-cyclical spending, but in the context of a debt crisis, this was not good news. A trade agreement between the two most powerful blocs in the world, apart from everything else, was seen as something that could act as a huge economic stimulant at cost zero. So this was why it was so wonderfully attractive. It wouldn't cost anything. You wouldn't have to get into debt, but it would promote economic growth on both sides of the Atlantic. So that was why it was really, by 2011, Obama and Barroso were absolutely convinced. It took them another 2 years to get the thing launched. During that time, various studies were made, feasibility studies were made, internal by the Commission and by the US administration, who confirmed that we could go for this. It is possible. There is room for an agreement of this scale. So they confirmed that. And then there were studies on the economics of the thing saying that this could really lead to economic growth. So both because of these studies, the internal studies, the public studies, and member states governments also produced their own studies, there was this impetus to start the thing. So the political impetus, the thing that actually pushed the thing over, was the reaction to the economic crisis. But many of the factors or the interests were long-standing. They just needed the political factor to get the thing started. Perhaps one final point before I pass back to you, a long answer, but I'll try to be short.
No worries, Mark.
One final point that was that when, right back in 2013, when the thing started, Michael Froman, the US head of trade negotiations, said very clearly that he thought this had to be done on one tank of gas, meaning he thinks you don't want to refill the car. It had to be done just as soon as possible. At the time, many people took that as meaning it was an aspiration to get it done quickly. It was just wishful thinking. Trade agreements take a long time. Looking back now, I think that was also a warning, a very clear warning, which people didn't. Well, I'm going to say very clear warning. It was a warning which wasn't clear enough that people didn't pick up on. Because what he was saying was you have to do it whilst the political window of opportunity is open. And that window was only open for a limited amount of time. It was shorter than we thought it was going to be, irrespective of Trump. And so in that respect, yeah, that warning was there from the start, that we can do. There is a political moment, this could happen, but it needs to happen quickly. And it didn't happen quickly. And that's one of the reasons why things possibly didn't work out. But we'll come on to that later. Okay, I'm sorry, I'll stop there.
No, please don't. Thank you very much, Mark. I couldn't agree more on your perspective of how tied together the economics and the politics of trade agreements go. I could say, I have the, perhaps because I'm a political scientist, but I have the feeling that most times this political phase of the trade agreements is omitted, or it's not entirely introduced in the equation to explain why and how any trade agreement is launched and finally concluded. It's and in this vein, this idea of the wonderful political window of opportunity that was presented to Washington and Brussels in 2013, trying to find an alternative, an appealing alternative to both domestic constituencies, to find a way out of the economic crisis, 2007, 2008 financial and economic crisis, was perceived as a no return point. It was then or never. And I'm glad that you presented it that way, because I'm very in line with this reasoning. However, I mean, and you also mentioned a quite interesting aspect, which was that basically this TTIP was perceived as a cost zero solution for both parties. However, and here this is my second question, or my second line of thought. However, in politics, or in political behavior, cost is not only measured in terms of in economic terms. Cost is also measured on political terms, on the legitimacy of this of any decision taken by the political decision makers. In that vein, the TTIP was highly costly, for perhaps not as high for the U.S. administration, but it was quite high. The political cost of the negotiations of the TTIP were unexpected on the European shore. Many voices rapidly criticized the agreement, both on the content and on the way, on the formalities, on the way the negotiations were developed. Don't you think that this political cost was a totally unexpected result of the launching of the TTIP? I was thinking it was 2015, 2016. I don't remember exactly, but I remember about a demonstration in Madrid, and the slogan was, "It's not an agreement; it's a putsch. It's a coup d'état." The political impact of the TTIP could not be compared to any previous trade agreement. And of course, these political costs were high. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure. I think in the very immediate situation, so in the very short term, the political situation was unexpectedly difficult. Yes. In terms of the medium or long term costs, I'm not sure there are many. I mean, because it was a protest that grew out of nothing and then disappeared. And I think you have to analyze it clearly about the campaign itself. Perhaps if I say a few things about the campaign itself and then link it to that, it would be better. Because I mean, in terms of the campaign itself, a few features about it. So the first thing was it was amazingly effective, and it came out of nowhere. It was unexpected. Trade policy. This was the whole thing that the people in the DG Trade that I used to talk to all the time. It was before TTIP, it was difficult to hold any public meeting. If you held a public meeting about trade policy anywhere, then you'd have to hold it in a room with a table because there wouldn't be enough people to have an audience. So it wasn't something that interested people, and suddenly it did. Suddenly you had, as you did, not just in Madrid, but in Berlin and Brussels, London, you had huge protests, massive protests. Barcelona itself declared itself as an anti-TTIP city and led a network of cities against TTIP. It was a hugely successful campaign, very, very effective in terms of being a campaign. Whether it was successful in its objectives is a separate question, but it was certainly successful as a campaign. Part of that was because it used, because of the choice of issues, because of the way it used social media, which was something quite new in 2013, 2014. Now we're much more used to it. It was very effective for those reasons. Part of the reason it was because there was this long-standing issue in the United States, the protest against Nafta, and many of the protesters, the key people who'd led the anti-NAFTA campaign, advised the people in, I mean, this is like a conspiracy theory, but it wasn't. I mean, a lot of these senior American people were invited over as guest speakers here, and they gave a lot of good advice about how to run a campaign, how to make trade policy interesting enough that you will get thousands and thousands of people on the streets, because that's not obvious. And they managed it. And I think in terms of that, I was obviously defending the European Commission point of view through all of that time. I was amazed at the dedication of these people. People were giving up huge amounts of their free time to run campaigns, to go on protests, to evening debates at town halls and this kind of thing. And to a certain extent, and maybe I shouldn't be misinterpreted on this, because but it was one of the policemen on the Capitol, U.S. Capitol, said the other day, these people really believe that they were trying to save the world. The TTIP protesters were certainly not violent; they don't break the law at all. But I had felt something similar in that a lot of the campaign itself was not fact-based. That's the sort of thing I would say in the Commission. I know I'm an academic, I can say it wasn't true. It wasn't true, and when it was true, it was often very, very misleading. So it wasn't a truth-based campaign. It certainly didn't engage with the facts or aim to negotiate and change the policy. And these people were very convinced that there was, as you said, a threat to democracy, a threat to compulsory privatization, threat to democracy, lowering of standards, secrecy, big business winning out over government. All of these things, they really believed it. They really believed it. And there are very good arguments that you could say, well, that wasn't true. And if you analyze it, now we can analyze the income, and I invite people to do so. I mean, I'm going to tell you it wasn't true, but look at the facts and analyze it and come to your own opinion. But these people nonetheless invested so much energy, and it created a political momentum that then made it was very difficult for people to speak out against, to speak in favor of the TTIP. And certainly business associations and politicians who you would expect to have favored the agreement were conspicuous by their silence for a lot of the time, and that didn't help things. And academics as well. I think I've got it here somewhere. I was keep looking through my files. I've got the University of Barcelona organised a conference over 2 days, which was called TTIP, Soberanía Secuestrada, Derechos en Peligro. So sovereignty kidnapped, rights in danger, and it was a 2-day program where there was organised by the University of Barcelona with the support of the Barcelona City Hall and the Catalan government. And there was not a single speaker in favour of TTIP, and the Commission, as the negotiator, was not invited to defend it. So you were presenting just one point of view. Now, as a campaigner, if you want to do that as a political campaign, that's perfectly fine. But as an academic, if you're pretending to be an academic and analyse things, then only inviting people from one point of view is a very, very strange thing to do. But it was very typical of the atmosphere that there was at the time. It was very difficult to go. I was usually the one person in the room trying to defend TTIP, and there's times where I had hundreds of people all quite angry with me and all convinced that I was trying to sell them something terrible. So I think that there's, I mean, the issues behind it were not necessarily linked with trade policy. Again, it's much more to do with foreign policy and domestic policy. There were a whole range of issues. Some of it was this, like I said, with this domestic policy, defending our own interests. We don't want our standards to be damaged. I can come back to that in a moment if you'd like me to. And another aspect was this foreign policy thing. I mean, if you're anti-European Union, anti-American, and anti-capitalist, then a trade agreement between the European Union is about the most demonic thing in the world. You can't get more than 3 devils in the same room at the same time. So of course there was this huge element of ideology and other reasons that came out behind the campaign as well. So it was pretty, and maybe just to go back to your point about the success or not of the campaign, I think one of the difficulties in the success or not of the campaign, partly because, as I said, trade already exists. You're talking about a huge relationship. So a peak of a few years of a campaign, however impressive it was for those years, wasn't sustained enough to change the policy interest when there's this huge amount of money and it's constant every year. So there was part of that, but also in terms of the protests itself, the protest, it's a bit like Brexit in a way that it's very easy to say no to something, but unless you put forward a policy alternative, it's very difficult to change policy. So unless you've got a clear alternative, you say we don't want to be here. Okay, I understand that, but unless you say we want to be there, then it's very difficult to orient policy. Okay, we know you don't want to be here. Fine. Where do you want to be? Where do we get there? How do we, so unless you've got an alternative, it's very difficult to change policy or adapt policy. So that was one point. And because it wasn't based on truth, a lot of these things weren't true. The amount of change you could make was limited as well. So yeah, I mean, it was successful as a campaign. In terms of the changes it made, it promoted some changes, some things that needed to be changed in terms of trade policy, to improve trade policy. Some changes were made, and we can look at those again if you want. And that was a success, but it was not what the campaigners were asking for. But it wasn't clear what the campaigners were asking for. Just no trade. We're just going to build a wall and not deal with America anymore. Those 3 billion, all the people who are interested in that 3 billion euros a day are just going to say, okay, fine, we'll stop that then. It's not going to happen. You need an alternative, and because an alternative wasn't presented, or a clear alternative wasn't presented, because it wasn't a coherent campaign in terms of being based on fact and producing a policy alternative, the long-term effects were probably less than could have been imagined at the time.
Yes, I was smiling while hearing you, because some of the images you were depicting make me thought of those years. I agree to a certain extent that the TTIP was a kind of a straw man that everyone, I mean, those campaigners, those anti-TTIP campaigners hit, but without offering a clear alternative. So it's quite, and this talks us about how political discourse can be built up, right? It's much easy to build a discourse on a negative, on the negation of a fact than a positive a statement where you don't reduce yourself to say no, but you propose an alternative. That was an issue, and then the second issue, and you mentioned it quite indirectly, but my impression is that the campaigners, the anti-TTIP campaigners, were very refined in picking up the very sensitive policy issues, the very sensitive aspects of the TTIP that knew that eventually may amplify their claims. And I remember at least two big issues that were always on the spotlight of these anti-TTIP campaigners. On the one side, the famous chicken, the famous chlorinated chicken. No one knew what the chlorinated chicken was, but everyone was against. Perhaps, and I'm not in a position to affirm it, but perhaps even with no scientific evidence. And secondly, all the claims against the investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, which were also presented as the dismantlation of the state, the collapse of our judiciary systems. The anti-campaigners, I mean, the campaigners, the anti-TTIP movements were very successful in picking up specific topics that resound in our societies as the evidence of dark interest behind the court and in the backstage of the agreement. Do you also have this feeling that the chicken and the investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms were wonderful targets to direct all this angriness, all these negative feelings among the anti-TTIP, the campaigners, among the anti-TTIP movements?
I think in terms of, yes, they chose their issues very well, because, as I said, trade policy it is a very technical issue. There are important political questions, but it's a very technical debate, and so it hadn't been of interest. It hadn't been of interest. And
sorry for interrupting you, but it's impossible to argue on the rules of origin, for instance, except that the technicians, no one fully understands the entire picture.
I think British companies are starting to work that out now.
I can imagine.
But the point with, say, the chlorinated chicken and the dispute investment disputes mechanisms, I think these points again. How do you get people interested? Well, you frighten them about health safety, and there's nothing more frightening than food safety, because you're eating; it's going to be part of your body. You're going to eat these things which are. And the other was with the dispute settlement, because it could be portrayed about big business beating democracy. Both claims were not really true. Not true at all. If you go back to, that's what I was looking at when you started saying that. If you go to the mandate for negotiations, I mean, maybe your perspective tends to be economics. My perspective, if I have a fault here, it tends to be overly legal. But the point is that when the European Union negotiates a trade agreement, the Council the European Council, so the heads of state and government, Mrs. Merkel, Mr. Macron, everybody, decide on a mandate for negotiations. They say you can negotiate this, you cannot negotiate that. So they fix the rules of what can be negotiated and say what they think in very general terms the agreement's going to look like. And that mandate is then legally binding. The Commission then has to go off and discuss that with the partners, in this case the Americans, and produce a proposed text. But that's just a proposed text. They don't decide it. They produce a proposed text, which then has to go back to the political decision makers, who then confirm that they want that text to enter it to have legal force. So the Commission negotiates, but it negotiates according to a mandate, and that mandate is legally binding. If the Commission goes beyond that mandate, that anybody, governments, but also you, me, or a TTIP protester, can take that to the European Court, and the European Court would say this is not allowed. So it is a binding mandate, which is an effective limitation on what can be negotiated. And if you look at that, then on these two cases, in terms of the chlorinated chicken, which is to do with different standards, what the TTIP was trying to do, and what's called second generation trade agreements are looking at, is to do regulatory convergence, to try and eliminate barriers to trade which are caused by the fact that one country does things one way and another country does them another way. The Article 8 of the mandate specifically says, and let me read a sentence to you, it says, the agreement, so the agreement with the United States, should recognize that the parties will not encourage trade or foreign direct investment by lowering domestic environmental, labor, or occupational health and safety legislation and standards, or by relaxing core standards or policies and legislation aimed at protecting and promoting cultural diversity. So all of this was not allowed. You were not allowed to lower standards. And if you lowered standards in order to promote trade, there would be a court case in front of the European Court of Justice. So that was not allowed. In terms of the investment, the mandate sets out a number of problems that have to be dealt with. It said that the current situation is not satisfactory. There was an agreement on that. Everybody agrees on that. Although the problems that were identified by the protesters weren't necessarily the real problems. But what it said was that we need a new system, that the member states will only agree to including investment protection in TTIP if there's a new system that satisfies a number of problems that are not being addressed sufficiently at the moment. One of those conditions that it put there, I listed the problems, and then it said as a condition to all of that, once you've dealt with all of these problems, as a condition to that, any agreement should be without prejudice to the right of the European Union and member states to adopt and enforce, in accordance with their respective powers, measures necessary to pursue legitimate public policy objectives such as social, environmental, security, stabilization, financial system, public health and safety, and so all of this was dealt with. They're saying all of this is outside of the investment protection. Every state has it. So all of this was dealt with within the mandate. It was not allowed. So this chlorinated chicken and the trade things were set there to frighten people. If you want, we can go into more details about what was proposed and what was the reality of it all. But the point is that this was used as part of the effectiveness of the campaign. As I said, it was not factually based, but it was very effective as a campaign.
So true, so true. I was wondering why the Commission, why it took so long for the Commission and the European institutions as such to react to these protesters' claims. Because I mean, it was just a matter to publish or to read out loudly, as you just did it now, to read out loudly the mandate, which was crystal clear in the sense that, firstly, there was no bottom to the race in the common standards, and second, I mean, in the European Union's in the single market standards, and second, the investment state dispute settlement mechanisms were alternative mechanisms to solve specific problems in a very, very narrow scope of issues. So there was no clear possibility of a spillover of those mechanisms. I was wondering why, if the mandate was so clear, the European Commission could not react more
I think on
strongly.
I think on this one case, I will disagree with you. In terms of how the Commission reacted, if you look at how public sector organizations react to what was a totally unexpected and full-blown communications crisis, public sector institutes are usually very bad at doing that. And I criticize the European Commission where it needs to be criticized. I'm allowed to do that now. But in this particular case, I think it reacted fast and well as it possibly could. The combination of Celia Malmström as the commissioner at the time, and very competent people in DG Trade, and I said I'm quite critical of the Commission in other areas, but this is an area that really works. People know their stuff. They really did in a short, relatively short. I mean, a year is a very short time in public administration. Is a very long time in communications. But within a year, Commission policy have been totally changed, not just in terms of the content, but in content to some extent, but in terms of the presentation of how we tried to explain things. They were open to really going back to the drawing board and saying, okay, this isn't working. What can we do that does work? And significant changes were made, and we can look at those if you want. I think that, but in terms of why it didn't work, I'm going to be terribly indiscreet here because you're recording it, so I should be careful. But I should be terribly indiscreet because a lot of these things annoyed me. I was invited to a meeting of very senior level at the. Shall I tell you what? No, one of the Catalan universities decided to make a public statement about its position on TTIP, and I was invited to defend at the last minute. They were almost going to pass it, and someone said, "Well, shouldn't we listen to the Commission?" So they invited me to come, and so there was me, the senior board of all the catedratics who I've forgotten what exactly was the Conseil Rector of the university, and a catedраtic who was very strongly against TTIP. And he said in his presentation, his argument, he said, do you know that in TTIP, there's a secret agreement that for every penny spent on public universities, you'll also have to spend a penny on private universities. So for every euro on public universities, you'll have to spend a euro on private universities. Well, private sector will take us over. And I said, no, there isn't. It doesn't even go anywhere. You can't show me talk about things in the mandate, talk about all of the texts have been proposed. We've got the whole proposed text here, we've got the mandate here, we've got all of the documentation, talk about any of this, but this doesn't appear anywhere. So I can't talk. Of course it doesn't appear anywhere. It's a secret agreement. Right. Okay. Now, as Commissioner, I wasn't allowed to say anything. These days I would be able to say things. I would do, well, okay, if you're talking about being academics, you have to take a scientific point of view, and a scientific point of view is based on facts. Once you start on conspiracy theories, it's impossible to kill them. And so it was exactly that. It was impossible to kill a lot of these stories once they started, and an awful lot of media space was given up to things that weren't. Greenpeace Germany leaked a secret document from the Commission, and it made the headlines. And the Commission tried to say, well, first of all, it wasn't secret because it's published on our webpage, and secondly, it's not true because what they did was they cut and paste different bits of old documents and put together a document. So it wasn't a real document, and secondly, there was nothing hidden. And also the sense of how you understand the document when you put it in its context had a different understanding. But all of that didn't matter because the headlines were there. Commission secret documents revealed by Greenpeace show that. Good grief. So it was a communications nightmare, and the Commission was very much on the back foot all the time. And just because it's very difficult to kill stories once they've started and got to that scale, I don't know how to do it.
Yes, perhaps that was one of the starting points in times in our contemporary history where fake news and these massive non-evidence-based campaigns were launched, right? But let's stop talking about the past, Mark, and because our time is running fast, and let's stare at the future. But before that, what do you think the European Union and more specifically the European Commission learned from this past experience? What changes have been implemented ever since? What specific formal or informal practices have been incorporated in the day-to-day of the European Commission, and more specifically in the day-to-day of DG Trade, while negotiating the forthcoming agreements? After the TTIP, we had the CETA with Canada. Some years later, we started considering the free trade agreement, but the economic and partnership agreement with Japan, and many other second and third generation trade agreements came afterwards. What lessons did the Commission draw from the TTIP, from the success and the failed aspects of those negotiations?
Well, I think first of all, I mean, the trade agreements you mentioned were all being negotiated in parallel at the same time. So, for example, CETA was pretty much finished before TTIP TTIP was halfway through. So, in that respect, the existing agreements weren't so much affected. I think if you look at what actually changed, certainly the Commission decided to up its game, and in terms of the provision of information, in terms of trying to communicate what it's trying to do. I think for me as a lawyer, the most important thing was the clarification on who does what. That one of the issues here was who has to decide. Is it a common commercial policy? So in principle, a common policy of the European Union only has to be decided at political level by the European Council, so the member states, governments, and the European Parliament. It doesn't have to be decided, go to member state level and be decided by all of the parliaments of the member states. And also there were claims for people calling for referendums, or Barcelona declaring itself as a city without TTIP, so being able to exit EU policy. So in that respect, things had to be clarified. And the issue here was what is trade policy and what is not, because it's clear that trade policy, if it's something to do with trade, and you're in a trade agreement, it only has to be agreed by the European Parliament and by the member states in the Council. It doesn't have to go to each of the individual parliaments. The reason why agreements like CETA have gone to all of the parliaments is because the agreements also included other aspects, so aspects that weren't trade policy. Very, very small. I mean, it's a tiny fraction of the clauses in CETA are about that. But they are there, and that means that it's a mixed agreement. It's not just trade, and so it has to be. So there was always a debate about what is trade policy and what's not. And in that respect, the Commission took its own trade agreement, the Singapore agreement, which had been finished, to the European Court of Justice, and it asked the European Justice to say whether it was a trade policy or not. And the European Court of Justice defined trade policy very clearly and very widely. So now what we're going to see, I think, in the future is that there'll be distinct agreements, that everything is in trade will be put into one agreement, and other things will be put into another agreement that will have to go to the member states. So we'll try and avoid the situation like with the Canada agreement now, that it's still pending, going through all of the different member states. So there's that in terms of clarification of what is trade policy and what people can do. In terms of investment protection, the proposal for the having a specific court on investment and very clear conditions, clearer than they were before, has come through. That was never, it didn't prosper in TTIP because TTIP failed itself. But the agreement was then put into the Canada agreement at the last minute after it, the agreement was reopened, just to put it in. It was put in the Vietnam agreement as bilateral courts, so just affecting that trade. But the proposal to have a world trade court that would deal with this matter globally has been put on the table. It's being discussed by the WTO at the moment. Certain WTO countries are trying to kick it into the long grass, is the expression, trying to make it at the current speed. It's anticipated that the negotiations will take 15 years. So yeah, they're killing it without killing it. But the proposal is there. In terms of what the transparency was improved, and maybe we can talk about it. It depends how much time you've got and what you want to concentrate on. But the important point here is that the trade negotiations were never secret. Information was restricted during the negotiation phase. So when there was a public debate on whether we should have a trade agreement with country X, that was a public debate. Once that agreement's been decided, there's a mandate and negotiations. That was always restricted information because it was felt that if you're negotiating with another country, you should play like a game of poker and you should hold your cards very secret. So the Commission, as the negotiator, sent weekly reports or regular reports to a specific person in each member state government and to the European Parliament Committee on Trade Policy. So these people, the Parliament and the member states, knew what was going on and had updated information. But it wasn't public until a proposal was finalized. And when the proposal was finished, that proposal didn't become law. That proposal was then made public and there was a public debate on the proposal. So there was only restriction during a particular time of the negotiation. That proved so unpopular that Malmstrom just said in the end, well, let's make everything open. Let's publish it. That totally amazed the Americans, who couldn't deal with it. The only thing the Europeans couldn't publish was the stuff the Americans had given them because that was still secret. And it altered the ways that negotiations are done now, because from that point, everything the European Union negotiates is open. It's all public. It's all published on the web page. Again, it had no impact on the debate on TTIP, on the attacks on TTIP, because it was still accused of being a secret agreement. But there's no other international negotiations which are conducted with all of the documents put on the web, on the official webpage of one of the parties. It doesn't exist anywhere else. So it was a huge thing. In terms of democratic controls, that wasn't changed because they were already there. It wasn't true that they weren't there. And in terms of how trade policy was thought, well, there was in 2016 there was a rethinking of the European Union trade policy called Trade for All, and in 2020 the new commissioner, now left, also proposed a major rethink. But this is to do with details and focus, and above all to make sure how small businesses participate, how we ensure that trade policy can coordinate and work with development policy. But really, because there was no concrete alternative proposed by the protest, that is not a factor in shaping the future of trade policy. If you ask me the next question, you say we're short of time. Tell me how much time we've got. So
that we still have 10-15 minutes left, unless our students want to jump in again. Please, everyone following the session, do not hesitate one single moment to raise your hands and write down your questions.
I'm happy to carry on. I'm no problem for me.
Okay. First, we have a question by Gianmarco, who says, maybe I didn't listen carefully, but how is the TTIP going to take care and include in trade little producers like local farmers or small industries? Because I think that part of the anti-TTIP problem in Europe was a sense of fear towards big competitors from the US. I think actually this is something that the new US administration will have to consider and to negotiate with the Commission in this next round of possibilities, right? Mark, what are your thoughts of that? I was thinking that in the EU-Japan trade agreement, there is a special chapter on SMEs, which is not very wide and very specific, but at least tries to incorporate these companies, which are a significant part of our productive sector in Europe and especially in Catalonia. They try to bring them on board. What are your thoughts of that?
Yeah, I mean, there are SME chapters in all of the trade agreements that the European Union has negotiated recently. So in the Canada agreement, in the Korea agreement, in the Japan agreement, and in others. I mean, 2 points in reply to the question. First of all, I think in terms of how TTIP was portrayed at the time, one of the arguments was that this was to do with small businesses. And don't forget that the American economy is largely small businesses as well. We sometimes focus on only on these huge corporations, but most of the industrial texture of the United States is small businesses, like it is here. Maybe they're not as small as they are in Spain and in Catalonia, but they're still small businesses. And the argument was that, well, for most of this, okay, we can facilitate things, we can make life a bit easier for these big multinational corporations with some of the trade issues, but most of the case, they're already here. Google doesn't need our help, Starbucks doesn't need our help, Amazon doesn't need our help. They're already here. So it was to do with small businesses. And I think, yes, there was a small business chapter proposed in TTIP, which is pretty much the same text as appears in the Japan agreement or the Canada agreement. Because it's a real issue. It's very difficult to know what you can actually do, because small businesses, first of all, don't often have the resources. If you're going to break into a different market, go abroad, it usually takes a couple of years. It takes at least before you're going to see any return on that. You have to invest a lot of money to start with, a lot of money being invested up front. You may or may not know local market conditions. You have to have, there's a lot of information problems, and you have to take a big risk. So you have to have enough time and resources in terms of people being able to dedicate time to this, with profits on orders on a 2 to 3 year horizon. So it's very difficult to get small businesses involved, and that was something that it happens within the European Union as well. I mean, talking to small businesses here, yeah, if they get an order from a client in Andalusia or in Galicia, then it's a logistical issue, but that's the only question. How do I get there, or how do I get the goods there? If you talk about a potential client in Perpignan, it's 2 hours away, but it's like being the other side of the galaxy, because it's a different regulatory regime, it's a different language, it's a different context, different consumers. We don't know. So there is this great reluctance. So how do you get SMEs involved is very, very complicated. There are lots of, I mean, in terms of what the SME agreements do, there are lots of different things you can try. I mean, one is the information. So the idea is that all of the information should be, trying to provide as much information as possible, broke down into sectors on the web. All of the administrative procedures that a company has to do in order to do it there should be a one-stop shop. So you should be able to do all of that online and through one body. So you can try and facilitate things. In terms of Canada, would be the purchasing, you can have that information all about public contracts up on the web, so SMEs they can look in one place to get all this information. They don't have to have a huge network of people looking for this information. You can do things like that. There are other techniques as well, but as we're running out of time, I won't go into them. But it is generally a very difficult problem. How do you get SMEs involved just in the single European market, let alone in export markets?
True. I was thinking of a final degree research project a couple of years ago here in ESCI-UPF. The student actually she was working on the CETA and how the CETA was amplifying the possibilities for Catalan exporters in Canada. And she actually discovered that most of the exporters on the specific industrial sector she was considering did not even know about the existence of the CETA, and they just preferred to give up and keep on paying the same tariff as usual, because the alternative, that's to say, to take advantage of the new regulatory framework, was too expensive in terms of indirect costs to their business. So that's one of the, I think Gianmarco was right in pointing to this issue, which is a long-standing problem in the EU trade negotiations and trade agreements. Ramon Chiffre writes, Mark, it was very interesting to listen to you revisiting the anti-TTIP campaign in recent years with alliances from many places. As an economist, I would like to ask your opinion about the topic. I've not made research on, and I'm curious. Which is your view on how trade and environmental concerns will interplay? The EU has already set up an ambitious goal for 2050 in environmental terms. What are the likely repercussions of that on the trade policy? And he thanks you for.
Hello, Ramon. I think really in terms of the environmental trip, it's one of the areas where the EU, and maybe sort of just parenthesis, sorry, maybe one thing we can look at quickly before before the session finishes is future relations under Biden, but certainly.
Yeah, I was determined on that. Yeah.
One of the issues here is where bilateral questions, and the other is where the EU and the US can work together on multilateral questions, and the environment is one of them. Because Biden says he's going to sign up to Paris again on his first day here, because John Kerry's now so we've got movement on that front. In terms of the specific environmental issues that have to be dealt with, yeah, some of it's quite difficult, because what you want to do is try to introduce these new climate protection measures, but at the same time not have it seen or have the effect of protectionism, and that can be difficult. So one of the reasons why the EU especially is most interested in having that done at WTO level, if at all possible, and if not at a multi-country level, not just the EU, is because then it won't be seen as something which the EU is trying to close its borders and it's using this as an excuse. So I think that's very important. At the moment, one of the issues which is most exercising thoughts is this idea of carbon neutrality, and that you're trying to reduce your carbon impact. And so in order to do that, you're going to have carbon taxes. You're going to have to restrict products that are made through what is seen as an excessive use or emissions of carbon. And if you set those standards in the European Union without creating barriers, then all that's going to happen is the production is going to move elsewhere. So you need to make sure that although the European market will remain open to everybody else, that they will have to keep these new carbon standards that the European Union creates will have to be applied to everybody else as well, to products coming into the European Union. Otherwise, there'll be the unfortunate term is carbon leakage, but it just means that you'll produce, things that produce a lot of carbon will just move outside the European Union and carry on anyway. how you do that is very difficult. So what we're looking at is trying to get that done through WTO agreements, and actually a surprising number of members of the WTO, including Russia and China, are interested in all of this. So there is possible movement on this. It's going to be complicated, it's going to be messy, but it's certainly better than. So that's one issue. There's other issues in terms of, say, due diligence, which they're looking at in terms of making companies responsible if the products, the wood products they have are related to deforestation outside the European Union. How can you make them responsible for that? The Americans are much more advanced on that than we are, so it's going to be interesting there if there's possibilities of combining. There's also discussion on reopening at least the issues that were proposed by the Environmental Goods Agreement. That was a multilateral agreement, so it wasn't the whole of the WTO, but it was a lot of WTO members. That sort of ran out of steam. But certainly now there's great interest in pushing that agenda forwards and seeing what can be done there. So yes, it is a very complicated issue, and the Commission is very aware of it, that by introducing these environmental standards, we have to make sure that products that come into the European Union also follow these standards, and we have to make sure that that does not then be seen as barriers to trade. So yeah, it's a very good question, and there aren't very good answers at the moment, but they're being worked on.
So true. These environmental concerns expressed many times in the recent years by the European Union are sadly perceived as protectionist measures, and direct protectionist measures.
I think again, just to disappoint. I mean, I think again that's reason why in its trade documents, I mean, for all of this stuff about the Brussels effect and Brussels trade, that the European Union is very clear on this, that the Commission will only refer to international standards. When it's telling people, it's not telling people what to do, it's getting them to abide by international standards. So the employment standards are all ILO standards, International Labour Organization standards, because that's not the European Union saying how it should be. There are international standards. And environmental standards are all related to Paris. And now that Biden's come back into Paris, hopefully that will strengthen the whole process again, which will mean that it gives the whole thing more force. But trade policy, as far as it can react positively, it means just including agreements that everybody will abide by their Paris obligations, which is already in all of the trade policies, that trade agreements that the European Union signs.
I agree. Mark, before finishing the session, I could like to look forward. I'd like to try to at least to describe briefly what are your expectations for the Biden administration in terms of trade. I would say my take is that President Biden will not jump, or Biden administration will not jump into trade negotiations overnight. This is something that will take some months, even some years before President Biden starts to dismantle what we have been witnessing in the recent years. My take is that there are too many domestic issues to be considered before launching the new administration to other challenges, right? But in terms of US, but this is my take on, of course, in terms of US-EU trade relations, what can we expect in the 2-3 next years?
I think, I mean, the first point is you're absolutely right. I agree with you, and it's possibly we're both wrong, but I think you're right that Biden has got such a difficult domestic agenda that how he's going to react to foreign policy, we'll have to see. But how he reacts to foreign policy cannot complicate further his domestic agenda, and that comes back to this idea of protectionism and buy America and whatever. That he can't do too many things that will give too many gifts to the opposition. So in his foreign policy, I mean, he will have to react to foreign policy things from day one, but he won't want to do things that complicate his domestic agenda unless he really has to. I think the immediate effect that the Commission is looking for is an improvement in the tone, the way things are done, the atmosphere, and also in predictability. And that's something maybe that was taken for granted up until a few years ago, and will be very welcome to come back. So I think that's the first point. And I think it's also important to say there aren't going to be any miracle solutions to things. And in terms of how trade policy develops, my guess is that it will be lots of very, very small steps. That the TTIP was seen as I said, it was a big idea, partly because they wanted it to be sold as a big idea, but also when Obama wanted to sell this as a big idea, as something to deal with the crisis. So they were interested in creating publicity for it. Now it's quite the opposite. Certainly on the European side, the desire is for trade policy to go back to being as boring and technical as possible, so we can just get on with it and without as much public scrutiny as you want. But let's not get any emotions involved here. It's going to be boring and technical and modest step by step. And I think that's what we're going to see. Specifics, I think. There are certain conflicts which, well, the Commission again sees as part of the normal friction. You've got the biggest trade relationship in the world, so there's obviously going to be points of disagreement, and there are points of friction which can get serious. And so you mentioned things like chlorinated chicken. That all is related to the EU's precautionary principles on safety standards. There's also the Boeing Airbus arguments about subsidies and whatever. That's being dealt with. That's already being dealt with. Negotiations are continuing with that. Countermeasures are being applied because that's what both sides have to do to get the other to the negotiating table. But I think in the end, there will be an agreement on Boeing and Airbus, if only because both parties recognize that at the moment they're the duopoly. And at a certain point, other people are going to start coming into this market. And so it would be in their interest, the American and the European interest, to have global rules sorted out as soon as possible before new people come into the market. So I think that's the one thing that's different is the tariffs on steel. And I think the European Union, generalizing it, but I think the European Union are very upset about the tariffs on steel because of the basis, because they were the basis for the steel tariffs was US security. So I think that is going to be a more friction point, shall we say. That's going to be something more complicated to solve. In a few months, the WTO ruling will allow the European Union to apply full countermeasures. So by the summer, Biden will have to take some steps in that. Otherwise, the European Union will apply full countermeasures. He may be reluctant to, because of course it's these so-called swing states for a lot of the states that where the vote was very close. So you have to see how that goes. But yes, that's going to be something to follow. And there's other aspects like the digital taxes that the European Union proposes all the time, which the Americans see as an attack on Google and on their industries, which is why the European Union is trying to negotiate that through the OECD rather than as the European Union, in order to make it seem less of a personal attack. So there's these specific things that have to be sorted out. In terms of bilateral relations, as I said, I think it'll be step by step. And we saw at the very end of last year, there was this lobster deal where the European Union eliminated tariffs on lobsters from the US, and the USA eliminated tariffs on ridiculously cigarette lighters and crystal glass and that. Anyway, it was a very small technical but confidence building measure, which I think is the key thing here. It was confidence building and allows for discussion to continue on other very small areas. The European Union, because of the emergency talks that Juncker had with Trump in 2018, in 2019 it was given a mandate to discuss industrial tariffs. So the European Union can discuss industrial tariffs and make agreements on industrial tariffs with the USA, and I think that is likely to go ahead. But we're saying very, very small punctual points rather than anything. And in multilateral issues, I mean, one of the questions I think Victor said about in the chat I can see about COVID. Yes, it's saying that things that will help the economic recovery are not seen as creating new barriers to traders, not seen as unfair subsidies or whatever. The environmental issues, again, which Ramon mentioned, and then if you can reform the whole of the system. I mean, those are the things where I think go into very specific details. Because if you come again to the idea of having an overall agreement, a big overall agreement, it didn't work. And one of the reasons it didn't work was that the interests were so different, and they weren't because perhaps the window of opportunity had closed. The two sides were not willing to make the concessions necessary for an agreement. That the US wants the EU to withdraw, to eliminate agricultural subsidies and agricultural tariffs and quotas, which is not going to do. And the EU wants the US to open up the public spending markets, which the US can't do. So and then there was also the question of international standards, which the US are not keen on. So because of these sort of very fundamental questions where there's no agreement, a macro agreement is just very, very unlikely. If Biden, by surprise, says this is what he wants to do and shocks everybody by saying that, then the European Union will probably have to react. But the European Union's position is against that, and my guess is that this idea of step-by-step little accords, little groups, is where we're going to go.
Yeah, completely agree. I completely agree. We cannot, regardless what we read in the front page, in the newspapers' front pages, we cannot expect a drastic change overnight. That could be quite complex and quite difficult to justify, at least in Washington. Mark, I guess we have a very last question. Lena asked if there is a specific industry which could benefit the most from this potential future agreement.
I think, I mean, it was very much, again, there was the whole point about a trade agreement is that there's thousands of pages. It's a huge pile of paper, and it's going through always lots of different things, and it goes into great detail on each different sector and each individual industry and its needs. So where the industries that could most benefit are the industries where there are currently most obstacles. So if you're talking about tariffs, you're talking about a lot of agricultural stuff where that's not going to happen. But there are areas where high tariffs are imposed where there may be some margin, and that the US and the EU don't want to reduce the tariffs now because that's a negotiating bargain. We'll get rid of the tariffs on this if you get rid of the tariffs on that. So there are areas that could benefit from that. In terms of specifically which industries could benefit most from regulatory convergence, I mean, I think the clue there is to look at the key areas that TTIP negotiated on, because the regulatory convergence, where you try and eliminate incompatible rules, we in TTIP focused on 10 different areas. I've got them here somewhere, but well, whatever. There were 10 specific areas where it was focused. So it was pesticides, it was car parts, it was medicines. if you look up those, so those are the areas that were obviously seen as priority, either partly because that's where the barriers are, and partly because that's where it would be possible to make solutions. The point to insist here is that we're not talking about lowering standards. We're talking about, say, in pharmaceuticals, the US and the EU have very, very high standards in pharmaceuticals. It's just that they're different. So if you say, if the EU and US could accept that both are trying to apply the highest possible standards, and therefore we accept each other's medicines, or we won't force a pharmaceutical company to do the same experiment twice, once in Europe and once in America. We can just do it once, and we can both agree that we'll accept the results of it. If we can do things like that, then we can reduce costs and so make it easier for those industries to work together.
And sometimes these agreements, these common agreements in pharmaceutical, for instance, are related to the capacity of domestic agencies to check and certify on behalf of the other, instead of that was the case in the CETA, for instance. I don't remember the specific sectors now, but these standards are, I mean, regulatory agencies in Canada and the European Union have now the capacity to certify the standard, right? The European and the Canadian, and this avoids, of course, significant cost to companies that do not need to, and the experiment again to be replicated on the other, on the partner.
I think that goes back to the point, I can't remember who made it now, about the SMEs. That for example, with CETA, the idea here was that I think there was one specific example was ecological wines. That if you want your wines to be certified as produced ecologically, in Canada there's different tests than there are in the European Union. And as a small wine producer, you cannot afford to pay for 2 experts to come over from Canada and spend a week doing all the tests, and then it's just prohibitively expensive. But if Canada accepts that the European Union inspectors, when they come and do the European tests, can also do the Canadian tests, then they get a Canadian certificate, and that small producer will be able to send the wines to Canada. And of course, the Canadian authorities can do the European tests in Canada. So by accepting that we trust each other's inspectorates, then we can make sure that we reduce costs and make those exports possible when before they weren't even possible. So yeah, there are lots of little techniques, but of course every little example like that is one little example in this huge text which is affecting all kinds of different areas, all kinds of sectors, and the different standards in each sector. The point to make, the key point, is that this is not a negotiation game. It's not like a game of poker where the negotiators are changing cards and exchanging. This is where you get the 2 regulatory bodies responsible. So the regulatory bodies in that particular sector, the Canadian wine sector and the Canadian agricultural sector and the UA agriculture, to come together and see what they think is good. They're not going to reduce any rules, but see what they accept as compatible. And that's mind-bogglingly complex, because that goes for each individual trade partner of the European Union and each individual sector. So it's very, very complex. And one of the discussions with the US will be about how we can make that maybe a little bit lighter, a little bit easier to do, but for, say, facilitating the work, not lowering the standards.
Yes. I think, except there is any final question, Mark, I think we pretty covered lots of things. We pretty got a very comprehensive perspective on these EU-US trade relations, the past, the present, and the future, even though we have no crystal ball with us, and it's always difficult to see, I mean, to say what's going to bring us the future. And for all that, we thank you very, very much, Mark, for joining us today. It was a wonderful talk about this very timely and interesting topics. And that's it. Thank you very much. And of course, we stay in touch. Thank you, Mark.
One of the disadvantages with doing all of this online is, of course, we can't have a coffee afterwards, and I can't answer the questions of the students afterwards. So I'm afraid. But yeah, I'd be very.
We hopefully go back. We'll get back to the offline settings in the coming future. Who knows? Until then, Mark, thank you again very, very much, and stay in touch. Cheers.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.